Welcome to the Restoration Activation Project video commentary series. Hi, I'm Marianne and I'm glad you could join me. In the last two commentaries, entitled A Higher Order Approach to the Awakening Process, Parts 1 and 2, I was looking into and sort of unpacking the ways you can use a deeper understanding of the ongoing balancing process that's always going on throughout the whole of consciousness. The balancing between its consciousness-regressive and consciousness-progressive characteristics, the baseline duality that is pervasive throughout the whole of consciousness, throughout all of its realities and timelines where that applies, and densities and dimensions and realms, and throughout all of the beings and other expressions of consciousness. But that balancing process is always going on through, within, and between all of these aspects and expressions of consciousness. Okay? And in today's commentary, I'm going to be examining some of the fundamental differences between regressive and progressive consciousness, between the two fundamental characteristics of consciousness. But before I do that, I want to go back to a little wisdom nugget that I mentioned in part 1, and it derived from, I came across this ages ago, and I believe it was sourced in some Zen Buddhist teachings, all right? And it's called the 4 levels of knowledge. And for those of you who saw the last video where I talked about that, I didn't spell it out, but I'm sure you recognized that the 4 levels of knowledge are basically an encapsulated description of kind of what goes on when you're on the conscious journey of awakening. Because the knowledge referred to, as in the 4 levels of knowledge, is higher order knowledge, as in knowledge and understanding of what we really are, of the way reality really works, the conditions, the principles of this reality, the rules of engagement, the principles of creation, the way things function, and all of that. Higher order knowledge is what it's referring to. And before I make the the point that I'm going to make, I'll restate the 4 levels. The first level is you don't know, and you don't know that you don't know. You don't know, and you don't know that you don't know. All right? The second level is you don't know, but you know that you don't know. The third level is you know, and you know that you know. And to many, that would seem like the highest order level of knowledge that anyone can attain. Well, if you've been on the journey a little bit longer, the fourth level will make sense to you. And to those whom it doesn't, I will spell it out. But the 4th level of knowledge is you know, but you don't know that you know. And what that means is that the highest order of knowledge is all the higher order knowledges that you are acquiring, will acquire, are so embodied within you. In other words, you're so in tune and have high-level access to your inner knowing, and you're in tune with core self, and you're transducing core self knowledge and capacities and energies and will at your highest capacity. Okay? So that you just are. You respond to situations and events and others with no conscious thought. You just know without consciously thinking or knowing the correct, parenthetically, consciousness progressive responses from moment to moment within any given situation. Okay? But the point that I wanted to make, that it's an important point, is that in our reality, even when we do come across higher order knowledge and we're able to discern and pull out those things that may be questionable, but we're actually getting to seeds of truth, even in those teachings or whatever information we run across, oftentimes, not always, but a lot of the time, things are presented in a linear fashion. In other words, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so forth. For example, the 4 levels of knowledge. But the truth is, and again, we are limited in this reality as to how to express. So sometimes we really don't have any better means of expression than through linear or within linear terms and descriptions. But this journey, and actually nothing within consciousness, is linear. Your journey, unique to you, is not a linear progression. And what I mean by that, and let's use the 4 levels of knowledge to work with. At any given moment on your journey, whether you're just getting started or you've been on it for a while and you're really functioning at a higher level consciousness, progressive consciousness capacity, we still move in and out of those different levels from one moment to the next, or from one day to the next, or from one situation to the next. For example, someone who may just be getting started on this journey from a conscious perspective, in other words, it's in their conscious now. They've been, maybe for most of their life, they've known that something's off or that there's something more that they're being called to do, but they're just basically getting started on the journey from a conscious awareness perspective. And perhaps they have a very intense mind-body complex experience. Some higher order knowledge comes to them, and it is a full body experience, and even though they're just getting started, well, that individual could, for some time, whether it's just in that moment or throughout the course of that day or for a few weeks or whatever, they've just walked into the 4th level of knowledge. Within the situations that they're in, the people they encounter, they are in the place of consciousness progressive response without thought about it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, someone who's been functioning primarily in 3rd and 4th levels of knowledge, something might happen, some event, they might get stuck on something along their journey, some distortion that they haven't quite gotten out by its roots is coming to the forefront, and they dip back down to the 2nd level of knowledge. They don't know but they know that they don't know. So I just wanted to make that point. This journey is not linear. You might have linear phases, but it's a moving, dynamic process, just like consciousness itself. Dynamic, moving. We can't understand. There's no way one individual can ever understand all of the movements and workings and the will of the whole of consciousness itself. Okay, the whole. We cannot understand that, but we can get a handle on various fundamental aspects and workings of consciousness towards advancing our progress on this journey, which is why I wanted to speak at length about the balancing process, because it is fundamental. And once we're in the flow of that, we can make remarkable progress on our journey. Okay? Now, getting into today's topic is, which is contrasting regressive and progressive consciousness. So we can really get down into what that means in terms of day-to-day living and day-to-day situations and so forth. But first, I'm going to approach it from a zoomed out perspective. Zooming out is really good, to zoom out and really, because it's how we begin to embody the higher order understandings for purposes of zooming back in and applying it in our lives, bringing that knowledge into this reality, creating through that knowledge. All right? So, from a zoomed out perspective, regressive consciousness are those entities, expressions, forces within the whole of consciousness that contract, deplete, consume, if you will, consciousness and vital energy. Progressive consciousness seeks to expand and amplify and add to consciousness, that pure potential and vital energy. That's at the highest order level. That's what these two different forces are doing in opposition to one another, for the purpose of creating that friction that enables the whole of consciousness and all its contents to exist, to be. Okay? Now, still at the zoomed out perspective, regressive consciousness is seeking oneness, by way of sameness. And it does so by attempting to suppress and eliminate differences, which would mean suppression and elimination of individuality in consciousness, in expressions of consciousness. Okay? On the other hand, progressive consciousness seeks wholeness through embodiment and creational expression of uniqueness. Uniqueness, wholeness attained through all the different expressions, unique expressions of consciousness. Wholeness through uniqueness versus oneness by way of sameness. Now we're zooming in now. We're getting down to individual expressions. Consciousness regressive, consciousness progressive. All right? Now, the various regressive expressions of consciousness, whatever the density, no matter how high the density the individual might be expressing through, some form of ego exists. Individual expressions of consciousness all have some form of ego and personality. Of course, it's less granular at the higher densities, the higher levels of density. But there's some form there. But let's zoom it down into the beings, both off-world, non-physical, and the human and other beings within our reality. Regressive, their regressive creations are egocentric and thus fear-driven creations. In other words, and we create through our thoughts, emotions, and actions. On the other hand, progressive consciousness is will, of course, self-driven, means that it is fueled not by fear, but by real love-driven, real compassion-driven creation through thought, feeling, and action. And again, real love is the utter acceptance of self and other as is right now. Doesn't mean that we necessarily like other or self right now, but we accept what is. We don't wait to accept until other or self is some more perfected version or something more like us or what we wish things to be. Acceptance as is of self and other and all expressions of consciousness. Regressive consciousness, through its expressions, individuals, is outcome driven. There is always, it seeks a specific end, which is contraction, consuming vital energies and pure potentiality, because it is afraid and it needs to see and experience what it seeks is the experience of what it's trying to accomplish. Sort of a reassurance, if you will. Whereas progressive consciousness is growth-centered. Regressive consciousness understands that although those of us on this journey, for example, and that's pretty much who I'm speaking to when I'm relating this information. That is who I'm speaking to. So always in that context. If I'm addressing an issue relating to the greater population, I'll state that. But otherwise, I'm speaking to those who are, and they know they are pretty sure they're on a conscious journey of awakening, all right? But it's a growth-centered process. Consciousness, progressive consciousness, understands that. And yes, there are things that we wish to accomplish along the way, understandings that we wish to gain access to. Perhaps we're working on getting the mind-body complex more fit, for example. But there's an understanding that it's about the process and that the outcome may or may not be what we envision. The higher order progressive consciousness doesn't envision any outcome. It just acts with a clear consciousness progressive intention behind whatever actions, thoughts, emotions that it's performing. Okay? Because regressive consciousness is egocentric, thus fear-driven, there is ego identification and attachments. It's just the nature of regressive consciousness. It carries certain baseline distortions. It just does. And some of those attachments involve the various roles that one might be performing in life, such as doctor, lawyer, teacher, nurse, counselor, coach. It doesn't matter. But they see themselves as these roles they're playing. Mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter. This is how they identify. This is what they think they are. And they create through that. Other attachments can be around agendas, as I mentioned a little earlier. They have a specific outcome that they're attached to. Possessions, excuse me, pardon me, material possessions, home, car, clothing, whatever, but material possessions. They identify, they see the possessions that they have as contributing to a part of what they are. Okay? Sometimes, many times, the attachments are to others, other people. Attachments to a relationship, a marriage, significant other, parent-child. They have attachment to and they identify with that type of relationship. Other attachments can include events, situations, and circumstances. But somehow, in some way, they are ego identifying and thus attached to whatever they think that, or however they think that situation or the circumstances or the event defines what they are, who they are. Okay? Progressive consciousness is core self. identified with no attachments. No attachments to possessions, agendas, roles, relationships, other people, events, situations, circumstances. No attachments. That's a key component of real love. The utter acceptance of what is, but you don't identify with that because it has nothing to do with what you are. Yes, relationships with others and the roles that we play in our careers, in our personal lives. Those are all part of the balancing process as it is specific to the individual. Consciousness is always seeking to balance itself through all of its expressions, between all of its expressions, and expressions of consciousness are event situations, material items, people, other beings of all shapes, sizes, colors, characteristics. But that's the balancing process. Progressive consciousness understands, or is working, seeking to understand and embody that. And they understand this consciousness, progressive consciousness understands that this balancing process is going on from moment to moment to moment. And that the individual, that is not what the individual is. It's part of a process that the individual expression is experiencing. No attachments. No identification with that. The only identification is with core self-will, will of the whole of consciousness in that process. Okay? Regressive consciousness focuses on material or other forms of personal gain towards the fulfillment of fear-driven egoic desires. And that personal gain from a higher density being's perspective would be our consciousness, our genetics, our vital energy. That's the focus there. And if those that are present on this planet operating through other humans, then that would involve material possessions as well. These great accumulations of huge wealth, ownership of resources, because all of those things advance their consciousness regressive purpose in this reality. Those are tools that they use to regress, suppress consciousness, progressive consciousness. On this planet, they've set things up way back when, in hand with certain humans, the financial systems, money, these institutions of control, religion, government, education. Those are all tools towards the ultimate goal of stealing our pure consciousness and potential and vital energies to either feed on directly or harvest for purposes of trade and or sale to other beings for a number of purposes. Okay? But it's all about the fulfillment, the consumption on some level or another of consciousness progressive energies and potential through our genetics, the physical expenditure of energy on this planet, in our work, in our jobs, and through our thoughts and feelings, and our physical movement. That's why they seek constantly to direct all of those, because those are creational acts which produce and are generated from energies. Okay? Progressive consciousness is focused on identifying, continually seeking to clarify and fulfill core self will and desire for this version of itself in this reality at this time. That's the focus. And this focus can be depending upon the individual, because if you watch the two prior commentaries to this one, each expression of consciousness comprises, from one moment to the next, various levels and degrees of both regressive and progressive consciousness. Now, those of us on a conscious journey of awakening, core self will for us in this reality at this time, high level, as part of the balancing process, desires for us to function through primarily progressive consciousness, in order to bring this reality back into balance, as we are currently in a consciousness-regressive dominant reality. It's way out of balance, which is apparent. But that's what we're here. That's the higher order purpose of this version of core self in this reality at this time. And the way we bring balance is by creating through consciousness, progressive consciousness. Okay? But within each of us, as I said, from one moment to the next, depending upon the situation and what distortions we carry, what false beliefs we may still be operating through, various external influences that push those buttons, those hooks, latch onto those hooks, the distortions within us, to attempt to play with us. And again, it's all part of the balancing process that affords us the opportunity to bring things into balance. Perhaps we do need to clear distortion, that meaning that we need to, for example, change our eating habits. We're getting interferences in that area. Perhaps we're having some physical ailments or some general malaise or whatever, but that's for the individual to look into, to bring that aspect of itself back into balance. But the degree and the level, the mix is unique to each unique expression of consciousness. Again, those of us on this journey, core self's intention is to predominantly create through consciousness, progressive consciousness. Some people will refer to that as bringing light to the dark. The same fundamental purpose, but that's the journey of awakening. Bringing consciousness, progressive creation into this reality at this time for the purpose of bringing balance. Consciousness is always seeking to balance itself through, within, and between all of its expressions. Okay? Regressive consciousness creates, in other words, thoughts, feelings, behaviors through a lens of self-importance. Whether that lens in that moment happens to be the superiority lens or the inferiority lens, which are both two faces of the same coin. And that superiority or inferiority to other to other beings and expressions of consciousness. And for a more in-depth understanding of self-importance, I recently posted an article entitled 4 Disorders. Let's see here, what did I call it? 4 disorders that keep us trapped in consciousness, regressive patterns of creation. Okay? So you'll probably want to look at that to get a really good understanding of self-importance. Progressive consciousness understands the inherent underlying purpose and therefore the value of all expressions of consciousness, regressive as well as progressive. Progressive consciousness sees itself as neither superior nor inferior to any other expression of consciousness. Real love, utter acceptance of self and other as is, recognizing even if that individual maybe can't fully see the specifics of the value of any given other in a situation, but there is an inner peace because there is understanding that of inherent value in all expressions. Consciousness progressive individual has embodied that, and even if it doesn't yet understand the specifics of what's going on or what's happened, or it does know, it knows. The individual embodies the understanding of inherent value because the individual understands the inherent purpose of other. And at the fundamental level, if we're talking about consciousness regressive expressions in the form of a person or another being, the individual recognizes without having to identify the value of the other, because it understands this whole balancing process, the dual nature of consciousness, that consciousness itself cannot exist without both fundamental characteristics. It is those two characteristics that enable creation and existence of consciousness. And the progressive dominant individual understands that. Okay. Regressive consciousness seeks to exploit, use, and control other, whether they're beings, forms of life, or inorganic beings and expressions. You know, everything from that perspective, the regressive perspective, is to be used to fulfill egoic desires. Everything and everyone. They want to, they exploit, use, and control, not just attempt to, others, but events, situations, by way of manipulation, coercion, threats, violence, and killing. It doesn't matter how they get what they want, as long as they get what they want. And regressive consciousness wants it all. It wants to consume itself. Consciousness consuming consciousness. And it's intense and it's focused. And the beings that operate this way, whether human or not, there's an intensity about it because it is fear-driven. Focused attention. Because these beings are driven by an intense level of fear. Think about the times that you've been intensely afraid. And use examples where you weren't so afraid that you were frozen, for example, but where you were so afraid of the consequences of something you just did, something that just happened, and every thought and feeling that you were experiencing was contractive. You were desperate. It was, in some cases, intense fear can make you feel like you can't even breathe. But it was so intense that in that moment, when you're consumed by fear, you do and say things that perhaps you never would in any other situation. A situation that's not fear-driven. But amplify that fear. The more powerful some of these humans and non-humans have become, despite what they present or how they present to the public at large, of being confident and self-secure in their holdings and their wealth and their power. Know, just know that they are operating in some area of their life, in some relationship, if not throughout their whole life. They are driven by intense fear. Progressive consciousness has a deep abiding trust in, and thus allows the unfoldment of reality as is. Progressive consciousness does not use, exploit, or seek to control others, events, situations, while continuously seeking ever greater capacities to transduce core self-will. And I say this all the time, and I'll say it again. Progressive consciousness creation does not mean that we allow consciousness regressive consciousness, whether in that moment through a person, an entity, or whatever, or a conscious regressive dominant situation, to just steamroll us, because that's not in accordance with real love. Real love includes self, and the fundamental rule of engagement is do no harm. So that means that includes self. So I just can't state this enough to people. This is never about, oh, I accept the other. They're part of this process. They're just doing what they do. And that's okay. It's all good. No, it isn't. Not when it impedes your ability to be safe, your abilities to proceed, to keep moving on this journey, or in any way tries to interfere with your work towards becoming ever more a consciousness progressive creator. It's not okay. There are boundaries. There are rules. And you're not creating through consciousness progressive consciousness if you're not functioning from the perspective and having thoughts and feelings and taking actions that are looking out for you in that context. And I'm not talking about my life is more valuable than other expressions and other life forms. Me above all else. I'm not talking about that either. So I hope you understand that that's clear. All right? And I'll put a link to another commentary called Real Love, Real Self-Love and Compassion below this video, just to help you further clarify what I'm talking about. All right? Okay. Regressive consciousness, those at a really high level, in particular, higher density beings, they seek truth. They seek higher order knowledge and understandings of that knowledge and higher order capacities, specifically for use towards the fulfillment of their egoic, thus fear-driven, consciousness-regressive purpose. Their desires and their agendas as consciousness-regressive beings in this reality at this time. So don't ever think that they don't understand the principles of creation, the rules of engagement, understanding and working with their understanding of the balancing process, using all of those things to fulfill their consciousness regressive creation purpose in this reality. Okay? Or the consciousness regressive dominant individual doesn't seek higher order knowledge, understandings, and capacities at all. They just go along from day to day. Now, and this can well apply to individuals that are intended, they're being called to a conscious journey of awakening, but they're asleep. They might have some stirrings on occasion, but they're not, maybe not paying attention or don't recognize wake-up calls for what they are. And so they're just going along to get along in day-to-day life in this reality as it is. Okay, so the higher order, the higher density beings seek it out. Others, and even other expressions of reality, other beings who are fulfilling a consciousness regressive purpose in the balancing process within this reality at this time, they may not be seeking higher order knowledge either. They're just doing it. They're just in the flow of consciousness regressive creation. Very simple for them. They just go along and they're doing exactly what core self intends, core self will, for that version of itself in that mind-body complex, in this reality at this time. And that's a point that I want to make here too. Throughout nearly all of the main cultural religions, as well as a lot of New Age teachings and so forth, have been corrupted. They were corrupt from the very beginning, because these dogmas were introduced by higher order, higher density, consciousness regressive beings who introduced them for a specific purpose: to regress consciousness. So, okay. But a lot of these teachings have people believing that ultimately our journey is leading us to a place of both within ourselves and the ultimate reality that is purely consciousness progressive, aka heaven, Valhalla, through the some of the Nordic teachings. Some of the other names escape me, but that's what all these places are supposed to be available to those that do what they're supposed to do, and then they'll get to that place. Well, those places don't exist. Even people that go, perhaps have some afterlife experience, the kind of experience that's going to be shown to them will be presented based on their belief systems that they carried with them when they leave the mind-body complex. But these are all illusions. How could they be true? How could there be a completely consciousness progressive reality, density, dimension anywhere in the whole of consciousness? It can't be. It can't be. Both characteristics, those fundamental characteristics, are pervasive. There's no escaping regressive consciousness. Now, true enough, there are realities as some version of this reality once was in another evolution cycle, predominantly consciousness progressive. That is the reality in which the original full human mind-body complex and its creators and it co-created predominantly consciousness progressive reality and dimension that unfolded from our higher density original capacities. Our baseline higher density capacity was fourth density, but we were able to function across and within all of the dimensions and densities of our world. Fourth, fifth, and sixth. But obviously, there were some consciousness regressive consciousness and beings and forces came to our world and in our world on this planet at that time who were creating through regressive consciousness. Otherwise, how could that once predominantly progressive consciousness evolution cycle have devolved into the pendulum swung. At some point, the reality was more balanced between the two aspects, regressive and progressive, which means it was less progressive because regressive consciousness was increasing to the point where we are today in however many sequential evolutionary cycles that were have been predominantly regressive cycles. The pendulum swings. Everything's about polarities. Everything is constantly about balancing. So there are some excuse me, there are some realities wherein, in fact, probably most, except for maybe low fourth density. That's probably a lot like this, except for capacities and so forth. And some of the rules of engagement are different. Some of the rules of functioning are different. And I'm going to do a commentary about that too. But, pardon me, in some, and typically this is in the higher density realities, they're regressive and progressive aspects of that reality are likely much more separate, if you will, unlike this reality where everything is just into this big pot, this melding pot, where from one situation to the next, one person to the next, you're going to encounter both. Regressive, progressive, regressive, progressive. It's more distinct and separate in different realities. But that doesn't mean that, in fact, in those cases, there is intentional interactions between the progressive and regressive beings and entities because they understand the balancing process. And as I talked about in one of the two prior videos, in the second one, part 2, oftentimes because they're trying consciously, they're seeking consciously to fulfill their purpose, regressive or progressive, in this reality at this time, even if it's not in our realm, but they can interact with our realm. And so sometimes they work together. And if you want more specific examples of how that can occur, watch that video. But it's a little more distinct and separate in some of these other realities, but both exist, both are. There's no escaping that. There's no running away from that. There's a lot of talk about fifth density. I can't wait to get to fifth density in the New Age, number of the New Age communities. Well, guess what? Fifth density has issues and struggles, and there's friction between regressive and progressive consciousness. And I would say it could be pretty intense there too, if they're talking about moving into the fifth density of our reality. As above, so below. As below, so above. I mean, look at all the friction and conflict going on here. Principles of creation. Okay? Progressive consciousness seeks higher order knowledge, understandings of that knowledge, and higher order capacities for the express purpose of aligning with and fulfilling core self, thus real love-driven desires and will. That's the point. That's the why. It's not about seeking higher order knowledge to satisfy ego, to reinforce a sense of self-importance. Progressive consciousness seeks higher order knowledge and understandings and capacities for the express purpose of being able to more and more create through consciousness, progressive consciousness, fulfilling core self's will and desire for this version of itself in this reality at this time. Okay, I hope these breakdowns have helped you a bit to really get more and more clear about some of the fundamental differences between regressive and progressive consciousness. And again, the purpose in sharing these with you, you will do with them what you will. But my intention in sharing and contrasting is to help you further embody core self-will for you in this version of itself at this time, which is the fulfillment of your purpose in creating through progressive consciousness in your own unique ways, your unique purpose. Okay? In the next video, I believe I'm going to get into to explore purpose and unique purpose, because all of that relates directly to this whole process and to what I've just been talking about, this balancing process, and getting a little bit more into what unique purpose and fulfillment and all really is. But in any case, or I may not, it may be another topic, we'll see. But in any case, if you are benefiting or benefited from this video and benefiting from the other commentaries, I hope you'll subscribe. And the best place to do that is on my website, because not only will you be notified of the commentaries as they become available, but I write articles as well that relate to and explain more. They work together. More information that can help you on your journey. So that's the best place to subscribe. And if these videos are of benefit to you and you've been watching for a bit, Donations of any size are welcomed and deeply appreciated so that I can keep doing this work, bringing this information to the forefront. Deeply appreciated. In any case, I thank you in advance for your support in watching, sending a donation, whatever. Just stay true to your conscious journey of awakening. And if you need any help, that's what I do. I can help you get more in tune with what core self is telling you, helping you figure out what you need to do. I hope you'll check that information out too on my website. In any case, safe travels on your journey till we meet again. Take care until then.